Welcome to Module 1 of Sensation and Perception Online. This presentation will cover the main philosophical background behind the modern study of sensation and perception. We'll touch on the empirical background, and we'll introduce the basic building blocks of the biology of perception. First, it is critical to recognize that what we are able to sense and perceive is limited by the sensory equipment that our bodies have. A simple example is that we recognize that we don't hear or smell things that our pet dog can hear or smell. In other words, our pets sense and perceive a world that is different from the one that we sense and perceive. If our senses are so limited, how can we know the truth about the world in which we live? How do we avoid, to the extent that we do, being tricked by our senses? How do we keep from ignoring important events that we cannot sense or perceive, but that influence us in other ways? One of these undetectable things is the simple relationship of cause and effect. We cannot see, hear, or taste causality. How do we know if one event causes another? This question has sparked philosophical division for centuries. Let us focus on just two broad philosophical approaches: nativism and empiricism. Nativism states that we are born knowing, or with access to knowledge, of some ideas and abilities. For Plato and Socrates, these innate ideas were known by our immortal soul, which joined with our physical body in this physical, apparent world for the duration of this short life, before returning to the world of forms, the true world. Socrates said that he who sees with his eyes is blind. Instead, to see truth, one must remember that the soul already knows, and perhaps gain truth through divine insight. Some contemporary psychologists, like Noam Chomsky and Steven Pinker, argue that some cognitive and psychological abilities are innate. In particular, they focus on language acquisition. Pinker, in particular, argues for an evolutionary adaptation account of these innate, inherited abilities. However, there is a problem with nativism. If an immortal and non-physical soul has knowledge, how does it interact with the physical body? This is the mind-body problem that René Descartes discussed. For Descartes, there was a place in the brain, the pineal gland, where this interaction took place. However, we now know that the pineal gland is not involved in trans-dimensional communication. Even referring to genetics is problematic. How do genes, which do really nothing other than copy themselves and build protein chains, how do they provide innate knowledge? The alternative to the nativist view is empiricism, which argues that while the brain may have an inborn ability to learn, it has no innate knowledge. That is, as Locke described it, it is a blank slate, free of content. From the empiricist perspective, the world in which we live is the real world, and we can gain knowledge about it through careful observation. We can conduct experiments in which we record events and search for relationships between events. The more reliable, that is consistent, and valid, that is accurate, our measures are, the more we will learn. It is crucial, though, that the events be objective, that is, that they can be observed by more than one person. This raises a new problem. How can an empiricist study sensation and perception, topics which are definitively subjective? After all, I can only assume that you and I see the same color of green when we're looking at the grass outside. I cannot see the grass through your eyes to verify that we are indeed seeing it the same way. To approach this issue, let's first discuss the basic goals of science. The first is to produce accurate, detailed descriptions of events. The second is to be able to predict when an event will occur. Lastly, science seeks to control events, that is, be able to turn events on and off. This is critical for the development of technologies. Returning now to the question of how to empirically study sensation and perception, this is the domain of psychophysics, the science of the relationship between physical and psychological events. In order to study psychological events, one must make them be objective events, that is, one must ask the participant to do something that others can observe and record. In sensation and perception, this something might be to report whether they detected a stimulus. You probably had a hearing test when you were in elementary school. If so, do you remember what it was like? A bunch of different tones at different volumes were played one at a time through earphones. You just had to say whether you heard the tone or not. That is, in essence, a psychological experiment. If the tones and the volume levels were randomized, then that is known as the method of constant stimuli. This is one method to determine the minimum level at which a stimulus is detected, that is, the absolute threshold. Another question might be whether two different stimuli appear to be the same or different from each other. The participant attends to the two stimuli and simply reports if they are the same or different. The point at which they correctly report that the stimuli are different 50% of the time is known as the difference threshold, or the just noticeable difference. This procedure could also be used to test whether two participants see color the same way. These methods open up the area of sensation perception to empirical study. Be sure to read about these methods that were used and the researchers involved in this area of study. How does the body actually sense and perceive the world? That is, how do our eyes change light, sound, and sugar into the experiences of images, music, and sweetness? Here, we discuss the basic biological building blocks of sensation and perception. The neuron. There are about 100 billion neurons in the human brain. Each neuron is a discrete cell with its own cell membrane. They are each a separate metabolic unit with their own self-contained parts. The basic parts that we will focus on are the dendrites, that receive inputs from other neurons, the soma, or cell body, the nucleus, which regulates the metabolic functions of the neuron, and the axon, which sends output to other neurons. As I stated, neurons are discrete units. That is, even though neurons appear to connect to each other, they are separate. They are not like electrical plugs or garden hoses. At the end of the axon, at the axon terminal, there is a synapse, or a synaptic cleft, a small gap between the presynaptic axon terminal and the postsynaptic dendrite. So, when a neuron is activated, it releases neurotransmitters, chemicals, like dopamine, serotonin, etc., into the synaptic cleft. The type of neurotransmitter depends on the neuron. Each neuron releases only one type of neurotransmitter, with a few exceptions. The neurotransmitter, once released, floats across the synaptic cleft and may come into contact with receptor sites on the postsynaptic neuron. If it does, then it may bind with the receptor site and either excite or inhibit the postsynaptic neuron. If the postsynaptic neuron is sufficiently excited, then it too will release neurotransmitters at its axon terminals. Now, let's look at the human brain. Remember, it is made up of about 100 billion neurons with an estimated 100 trillion synapses. For a brain researcher, that is a staggering population to sample. In comparison, there is an estimated 7 billion people in the world. So there are about 14 times more neurons in one human brain than there are people in the world. About a century of research on the human brain has revealed that particular parts in each brain tend to be involved in the same activities. So it makes sense to consider the brain by region. The major regions or lobes of the brain are the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. Some areas are dedicated primarily to perception. We will be revisiting these areas throughout the course. You should take some time to learn the locations of these areas. As shown above, these are the visual cortex, also known as the striate cortex, the auditory cortex, the olfactory cortex, and the somatosensory cortex. Finally, let's take a look at a demonstration. Looking at the image to the right, notice that one dot is missing from the circle of dots. Now, let your eyes move freely about while you detect what is changing in the image. You should notice that each dot is disappearing and reappearing in sequence. Alright, now stare at the plus. Keep your eyes fixated on it. What do you see? You should almost immediately see a green dot revolving around the circle of magenta dots. And if you're able to keep your eyes perfectly still, you should start wondering what happened to those magenta dots. They've disappeared. The take-home message of this demonstration is that our senses detect changes. Our senses are change detectors. To summarize, we've discussed that our senses are limited. So what we can perceive of the world is limited. As empiricists, we accept that we cannot know everything, but we strive to know what we can. With the help of technology, we can measure things that we cannot see or hear, helping us learn more than what our senses give us access to. Psychophysics was the pioneering science of sensation perception and established methods to objectively study the relationship between physical stimuli and subjective perception. Going beyond these relationships, scientists have studied the anatomy and physiology of our senses, discovering how our bodies work. Neurons were discovered to be the basic structural and functional units of the nervous system. In order to understand sensation perception, it is necessary to understand how neurons function and how neural transmission occurs. Additionally, some areas of the brain have been found to be dedicated to particular tasks. Throughout this course, we will be focusing on the areas that are dedicated to perception. Finally, our sensory system is a change detector system. Unchanging stimuli are quickly ignored and in some cases undetectable. But stimulus changes are detected and are often impossible to ignore. Throughout the course, we'll cover how our sensory systems detect changes in the environment.